Picture standing in the middle of the Sahara, and instead of endless sand, you're surrounded by forests, rivers, and lakes as far as the eye can see. Sounds impossible? A few thousand years ago, that was reality. The largest hot desert on Earth was once a green paradise. And this story sounds like science fiction. Today, the Sahara is roughly the size of the entire United States. Yet less than 1% of it is green or covered in water. The rest is rocky plateaus, gravel flats, sand seas, and dunes tall enough to rival skyscrapers. Add in brutal sandstorms, scorching daytime heat, and freezing nights, and it's no surprise almost nobody lives here. Somewhere between 2 and 4 million people call the Sahara home, which works out to less than 1 person per square mile, over 90 times less dense than the United States. Wildlife is just as scarce, making it one of the most extreme places on the planet for biodiversity, which makes its past almost unbelievable. Not that long ago, geologically speaking, this desert wasn't just less harsh, it was a full-blown paradise, green, covered in vegetation, dotted with lakes and rivers, and teeming with life. Scientists call this window the African humid period. The first hints came in the 1800s, when European explorers found strange rock carvings deep in the desert, in places like Merzuk, showing settlements and abundant life. More discoveries followed into the 1900s, including striking rock art in Libya depicting savanna animals that don't exist anywhere near the region today. By the 1930s, researchers had already floated the idea of a green Sahara. It wasn't until the late 20th century that solid proof emerged. Clear evidence of enormous ancient lakes and rivers that had once flowed through the Sahara and later dried up completely. Based on the age of these waterways and the rock art found nearby, this lost green Sahara is believed to have existed from roughly 14,600 years ago until about 5,000 years ago. In other words, while humanity's first civilizations were forming, the Sahara was still green. Here's the interesting part. Right before this lush period, the Sahara was actually harsher than it is now, stretching roughly 500 miles further south during the last ice age and swallowing nearly the entire Sahel. Researchers believe this came from weakened West African monsoons, worsened by iceberg breakups that cooled the oceans and disrupted global weather. Almost nothing survived here, and there's barely any trace of human presence at all. As the Ice Age loosened its grip around 17,000 years ago, largely due to shifts in Earth's orbit, small lakes began forming sheltered oases in the mountainous northern Sahara. But the real transformation came fast. Only around 1,500 to 2,000 years later, monsoons rapidly intensified, kicking off a feedback loop. More moisture meant more vegetation, which locked dust into the ground and made the monsoon even stronger. The changes swept across the Sahara at breathtaking speed. Areas like modern Egypt suddenly received many times more rainfall than before, and overall the Sahara was getting roughly 8 times today's precipitation. Over about 1,000 years, dried up lakes and rivers refilled, brand new ones appeared, and forests crept northward, pushing desertification back. Before long, the Sahara had essentially stopped being a desert, becoming a vast oasis covered mostly in vegetation and countless bodies of water. Some people imagine this lost Sahara as a mirror of the Amazon, but that comparison doesn't really hold. Scientists say there's no good modern equivalent. It was a genuinely one-of-a-kind landscape. Based on current models, large stretches became open. Savanna scattered with shrubs and trees. Even mountainous regions developed savanna-like conditions. Mangroves took root along the coast, and swamps, wetlands, and jungle-like environments flourished around the rivers and lakes, probably resembling something closer to modern Central Africa. This explosion of habitat triggered an equally massive population boom among animals. Species we still recognize from Africa today suddenly spread into places you'd never expect. As far north as modern-day Libya, rock art clearly shows giraffes, elephants, wildcats, lions, and leopards, all completely absent from the country today, with similar discoveries turning up in at least 6 other countries. This wasn't just a handful of stragglers. It was massive herds moving in on a huge scale. While most of these animals still exist elsewhere in Africa, a few didn't survive, including a smaller North African elephant, a particular hartebeest species, giant wild cattle called aurochs, and a massive buffalo with a 2-ton body and absurdly long horns. Others, like the scimitar oryx, survived but are now critically endangered, despite once thriving in huge numbers here. Walking across the Sahara during this period would have felt completely different, though one thing stayed the same: the heat. Despite all that moisture, it was still blisteringly hot, just slightly cooler thanks to the vegetation and standing water. Speaking of water, the Green Sahara might as well have been called the Blue Sahara. The Nile swelled to 2 or 3 times its current size, receiving more than 4 times today's rainfall, and regularly flooding enormous stretches of land. These floods were so extreme this era is sometimes called the Wild Nile period, with water levels surging to more than double what was recorded before the Aswan Dam was built. At times, flooding was so severe that large areas were too dangerous for permanent settlement. Still, this supercharged Nile supported an enormous variety of life: catfish, Nile perch, turtles, tilapia, and a much larger population of Nile crocodiles spread across virtually the entire river. Along its banks, massive herds of gazelles, hippos, rhinos, buffalo, hyenas, wildebeest, zebras, and elephants gathered. Essentially a wilder, more chaotic version of today's Serengeti. But even the mighty Nile wasn't the true showpiece. That honor goes to a lake that still exists today, but back then operated on a completely different scale. Lake Chad. During the humid period, it briefly became the largest lake on the entire planet, known as Mega Chad, stretching roughly 620 miles long and covering about 8% of the entire Sahara, an area roughly equal to the Caspian Sea. Despite its massive footprint, it was surprisingly shallow, reaching a maximum depth of around 600 feet, still enough to sustain a thriving ecosystem likely mirroring much of what lived in the Nile. And among all these animals gathering around the water, one species was especially familiar: us. Humans repopulated the Sahara as it turned lush, transforming the region into one of the most important cultural hubs of the ancient world. People began arriving roughly 1,000 years after the humid period kicked off, spreading rapidly from mountain ranges like the Caucasus Mountains to the shores of massive lakes. Some groups carved out homes in caves and rock shelters. Others built more permanent structures near water. Because human presence was so widespread, the Sahara today holds the highest concentration of rock art and cave paintings found anywhere on Earth. Many settlements were continuously inhabited for thousands of years, thanks to reliable water sources so essential that some cultures are literally referred to as aquatic societies today. Around 7,000 years ago, people began domesticating cattle, goats and sheep, sparking a second, even bigger population boom and a gradual shift toward permanent farming-based settlements, complete with some of the oldest known cemeteries and boats ever discovered. In every sense, this was the golden age of the Sahara. But like every golden age, it eventually had to end. Something made painfully obvious by the massive desert sitting there today. So how did something so lush collapse into a wasteland so fast? Once again, the answer comes down to climate change. Around 5,500 years ago, Earth's orbit shifted again. Global temperatures cooled, and the monsoons that had sustained the Green Sahara began weakening. The region started drying out at an alarming pace. Vegetation withered, and those once thriving lakes began shrinking all over again. Some researchers believe this great drying moved from north to south, meaning southern regions stayed protected for a couple thousand extra years before aridity eventually caught up with them too. As the greenery and water disappeared, wind erosion and dust production skyrocketed, especially around the shrinking Mega Chad Lake, which slowly transformed from a vast blue lake into what is now the single largest source of dust on the entire planet. Human populations were hit hard too, shifting from widespread permanent settlements to just a handful of survivors and a growing number of nomadic groups. In as little as 500 years, the landscape transformed into essentially what you see today. It's sad that the Green Sahara no longer exists, but the region seems to move through recurring cycles, and orbital projections suggest it could turn green again in as little as 10,000 years. Interestingly, the drying wasn't purely negative. It may have led to the rise of ancient Egypt itself. As the Sahara became unlivable, people relocated to the Nile Valley, a region largely inaccessible during the Green Sahara's peak. As the Nile shrank, it exposed a fertile valley with a dependable water source, triggering a wave of migration that helped set the stage for the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3000 BC. So who knows, maybe without the end of the Green Sahara, there would be no pharaohs at all. If this blew your mind, drop a like and subscribe, because every week there's a new fascinating story about our planet waiting here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.